US President Donald Trump visits survivors of last Saturday's massacre in El Paso, Texas, as scores of protesters accuse Trump and his anti-migrant rhetoric of fanning the flames of white supremacy. Pakistan throws out its Indian ambassador and suspends bilateral trade. Islamabad's response to India revoking the special status of Muslim-majority Kashmir. The USA, meanwhile, calling for restraint. And hundreds gather in Hong Kong for yet another pro-democracy protest. Demonstrators armed with the lasers that are now regularly used to distract police and thwart facial recognition software. Hello and welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. It's good to have you with us. US President Donald Trump has met victims and first responders from last weekend's deadly mass shooting in El Paso, Texas. That after a visit to Ohio, where he spoke to victims of a second gun attack that occurred just 13 hours later. The prime suspect in the El Paso attack is believed to have published a white supremacist manifesto online before committing the atrocity. Anti-Trump protesters gathering in both towns to denounce the arrival of a president whose anti-migrant rhetoric is, they believe, partly to blame for the bloodshed. Andrew Hillier has the story.
It was a controversial visit even before he touched down. At a time of national tragedy, US presidents have traditionally used the power of their office to unify the nation. But as Donald Trump walked down the steps of Air Force One in El Paso, the crowds of protesters weren't far away.
His hate speech has inspired people who might be prone to violence, and I see it as a direct result.
One of the Democratic hopefuls for the presidency pointed his finger at Trump for his repeated, provocative statements on immigrants.
We live in a country where we have a president who demonizes communities like this one, who says that those from Mexico are rapists and criminals and warns of invasions and infestations.
Trump himself steered clear of directly addressing accusations that his anti-immigrant rhetoric could have incited Saturday's shooter to gun down dozens of people, killing 22. Instead, he praised the work of police officers and hospital staff.
We went to the hospital, just came from the hospital. We met with also the doctors, the nurses, the medical staff. They have done an incredible job.
Hours earlier, it was the same story in Dayton, Ohio, the scene of another mass shooting. There too, protesters were out in force. After meeting with President Trump, the town's mayor slammed politicians for failing to act on guns.
Do I think that we're going to see another mass shooting tomorrow or Friday? Probably, because Washington will not move.
As he left Dayton, Trump took to Twitter to attack his political opponents. Despite mounting criticism, he insists he's bringing the nation together.
A little earlier we spoke to Alyssa Cavalier in Los Angeles. I asked her if there was any sign at all that these attacks were likely to bring about concrete change to US gun law.
We have a lot of Republicans now who are sort of trying to figure out a way. They're under more intense pressure to try and figure out a way to respond to these two shootings, two mass shootings with multiple victims, less than 24 hours, 13 hours apart. They met in Congress on Tuesday to try and figure out a way to help law enforcement take guns away from people who pose an imminent danger. But they've done this before. I mean, back in 2013, Sandy Hook was one of the worst shootings that we've had, and there have been quite a lot here in the United States, with 5- and 6-year-olds being, murdered, and nothing passed then. So a lot of Democrats are also trying to bring that into their campaign debates, but the Second Amendment is so strong here, it would take a lot to bring change with gun control.
Now, Trump's visit to El Paso comes as the first funerals for the 8 Mexican victims of the massacre are beginning to take place. The body of Elsa Mendoza was returned to her native Mexico on Wednesday, her husband describing her as the most wonderful of women in a Facebook post. The victim's cousin, meanwhile, insisting that now is the time to leave racism behind and start to do things differently. The government of beleaguered Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has announced it will not be taking part in the latest round of Norway-brokered talks in Barbados. That in retaliation against a new series of US sanctions intended to pile pressure on Maduro to quit. In January, opposition leader Juan Guaido invoked the constitution to assume a rival interim presidency on the grounds that Maduro's 2018 re-election was fraudulent. Pakistan has expelled India's ambassador and suspended bilateral trade with the country. That the latest fallout of India's decision to strip its part of the contested Kashmir region of its special status, doing away with a host of rights and freedoms the semi-autonomous region has benefited from for decades. Both Pakistan and China have voiced deep concern about that constitutional change. Yena Lee has the details.
Furious at India's decision to downgrade Kashmir's status, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan and his government have decided to retaliate. They'll expel India's High Commissioner and suspend bilateral trade.
Prime Minister Imran Khan directed that all diplomatic channels be activated to expose the brutal Indian racist regime and human rights violations.
Pakistanis aren't alone. Opposition forces in India as well as Indian Kashmiris have been voicing their anger at Prime Minister Narendra Modi's move.
I feel that is not democratic. It has violated all the democratic processes.
You're torturing us in the name of ordinary Indians. You're betraying them as much as us.
Meanwhile, in Indian-administered Kashmir, armed police patrol empty streets. There's been a crippling curfew since midnight Sunday. Despite this, sporadic protests have been taking place. Unrest in Kashmir dates back to partition, when the Hindu ruler of the Muslim-majority region decided to join India. Islamabad and New Delhi have gone to war twice over the disputed land. China, too, has at times claimed part of the region. On the Indian side, a secessionist rebellion and the ensuing crackdown has killed more than 70,000 people in the past 30 years. However, its partial autonomy had been granted in Article 370 of the country's constitution, an article that the Hindu nationalist government in power has revoked. Now, Indian-controlled Kashmir will lose its special status, its flag and its criminal code.
Time now to take a look at some other world news stories we're covering for you this hour here on France 24. Special forces in Kyrgyzstan have stormed the compound of the country's former president, but failed to detain him. One officer died from a gunshot wound after Almazbek Atambayev's supporters put up armed resistance, allegedly with live ammunition. The incident coming amid rising tensions between the former president and his successor, as authorities seek to prosecute Atambayev on corruption charges. Russia's main election board has upheld rulings that prevent a number of Kremlin critics from running in a Moscow election due to take place next month. The exclusion of opposition candidates has prompted outcry in recent weeks, with some 2,000 people detained, many of them only briefly, during the course of opposition rallies. Protesters accusing authorities of charging their preferred candidates with fabricated crimes in the run-up to that vote. And fresh fighting has erupted in the Yemeni city of Aden. Southern separatists clashed with presidential guards, killing 3 and injuring several others. The separatists and the internationally recognized government of President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi are nominally united in their battle against the country's Iran-backed Houthi rebels, the latest violence revealing tensions within the Saudi-backed anti-Houthi alliance. The United States has become the latest country to raise its travel warning for Hong Kong. That advisory saying that months of often violent anti-government protests in the semi-autonomous Chinese territory, which can take place with little or no notice, are likely to continue. Chinese main official in the territory saying the demonstrations are becoming increasingly violent. Thomas Waterhouse has the details.
A day after Beijing warned them not to play with fire, demonstrators in Hong Kong played with lasers instead. Flecks of light danced brightly on the facade of the city's Space Museum as crowds showed their support for one university student in particular. He was found in possession of 10 laser guns, which have been repeatedly used by protesters to damage police cameras and sabotage surveillance efforts. He was arrested during scuffles on Tuesday.
A large group of protesters surrounded Samsoipo police station, asking for the release of a person arrested for possession of offensive weapons. The gathering soon descended to a violent incident.
Since the pro-democracy rallies began, police have detained over 500 demonstrators and charged many of them with rioting. But after days of noisy protests, one corner of the city was more hushed on Wednesday as lawyers staged a silent march against politically motivated prosecutions.
We are here to uphold the rule of law. We call on the Secretary for Justice to account for the discriminatory treatment of what appear to be offenders under the law. They must be given the same treatment. They must be given the protection of the law.
Officials in Beijing, meanwhile, are said to be highly concerned by recent developments and are studying the situation to decide what steps, if any, they will take.
However Brexit turns out, the US is eager to sign a new free trade agreement with the UK as soon as possible. That announcement coming from US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo following a first visit to Washington by Britain's new Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. Raab insisting that the UK government would make sure the UK does leave the EU at the end of October, with or without a deal.
This government, this cabinet, is absolutely resolved, determined to leave the EU by the end of October. We will stay good friends and good neighbours with our European partners, but we are at the same time determined to seize the global opportunities beyond Europe for the United Kingdom. And of course, America is our single largest bilateral trading partner.
We support the United Kingdom's sovereign choice. However, Brexit ultimately shakes out, and we'll be on the doorstep, pen in hand, ready to sign a new free trade agreement at the earliest possible time.
To Sweden now, where a city west of Stockholm has begun charging beggars for so-called begging permits. Anyone found asking strangers for money without one is liable to face a fine of €370. Solange Mougin has the story.
This woman has just been told that if she wants to continue panhandling, she's going to have to fill out an application and pay €23 every 3 months for a permit to beg for money.
I went to the police station to ask if we needed to pay by day or by month. They said it's €23, but at first they study our request. Except we don't even have enough to feed ourselves.
Located west of Stockholm, Eskilstuna is the first town in Sweden to implement such a measure. Several other towns have outright banned begging, since being faced with an increased number of beggars, many of whom are Roma from Bulgaria and Romania. Officials say adding a bit of bureaucracy will make it more difficult to panhandle and will help local authorities, especially social services, to get in touch with the destitute. But critics and charities say the measure makes the neediest even more vulnerable. And they say the permits will create a system where criminal gangs will front the money and then demand extortionate repayments. For those caught without a permit, face a €370 fine.
Our role as police is to check if beggars have a permit. If they don't, then we'll apply the law, and they'll have to stop.
Officials say a handful of people have applied for permits, while others have been selling scavenged berries rather than outright begging. And more still have been issued warnings.
A welcome fit for a king greeted the first Latin American cyclist to ever win the Tour de France as he returned to his native Colombia. At just 22 years old, Egan Bernal is also the youngest champion the grueling multi-week race has seen in over a century. That victory making him a national treasure overnight. Well, that brings us to the end of this bulletin. Thank you very much for watching. You can, of course, head to our website, france24.com, for the latest on all today's world news stories, including, of course, Trump's visits to Texas and Ohio following those twin massacres last weekend. Trump receiving a less than warm reception by some people in both those towns. We'll be back in about 15 minutes' time with more news. Do stay tuned here on France 24.